Afternoon. So that since there are two people giving presentations, I want to give the speakers as much time with their talk. So I'll give my introduction so that while I'm giving my introduction, more people will probably come in. I mean, we have two speakers, both of them at the uh, in their early careers and are quite successful at this point in their careers. Dr. Tam Perry is an associate professor here at Wayne State University in the School of Social Work. Her research addresses urban aging from a life course perspective, focusing on how underserved older adults navigate their social and built environments in times of instability and change. She is co-director of the NIH-funded Community Liaison and Recruitment Core of the Michigan Center for African American Aging Research. She also currently serves as a research chair for the multi-agency coalition entitled Senior Housing Preservation Detroit. Two of her current projects are Navigating Time and Space, Experiences of Aging with Hemophilia, and Experiences of Belonging, Assessing Vulnerabilities of Older Detroiters within Changing Urban Environments. She has recently been selected to be a fellow in the Gerontological Society of America and currently serves as president of the Association for Gerontology and Education in Social Work. We have an international combination here because Brian Doucet is a Canada Research Chair in Urban Change and Social Inclusion and an associate professor at the University of Waterloo School of Planning. Born and raised in Toronto, he lived in the Netherlands between 2004 and 2017, where he obtained his MSc and PhD degrees from Utrecht University. Prior to moving to Waterloo, he taught geography and urban studies at Utrecht University and Erasmus University. Dr. Doucet's work critically examines the production and experiences of urban inequalities and long-term changes in cities. His research focuses on gentrification, displacement, and social justice, and is increasingly emphasizing the role that transportation plays in uneven geographies of the city. He uses a variety of methods, including photography and interviews. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Streetcars and Shifting Geographies of Toronto, which is a visual analysis of change. It's to be published by the University of Toronto Press with a co-author, Michael Doucet. This book uses repeat photography to explore long-term economic and social and spatial changes in Toronto. He's also co-editor of the forthcoming four-volume series, Global Reflections on COVID-19 and Urban Inequalities. His previous edited book, Why Detroit Matters, Decline, Renewal, and Hope in a Divided City, critically examines lessons and insights from Detroit. Dr. Doucet regularly publishes in academic journals, policy reports, and in the media. His first photography exhibition, Ordinary Cycling, on remarkable photos from the Netherlands, debuted in Toronto in 2019. He is currently a principal investigator in 3 NSHRC funded grants. Today, this outstanding group of scholars will collaborate in the presentation of the talk, Understanding Changing Landscapes in Urban Contexts. So I'll be happy to have them join us on the virtual podium.
So our plan is that Brian starts first and talks about his work, and then I'll do a second slide and talk a little bit about my work. But I guess I'll just tell everyone, thank you so much for coming to our virtual brown bag. Second of all, Brian and I met when I gave a talk at Waterloo, when I was a visiting professor at University of Toronto 2 years ago. And we've been finding different ways to collaborate over the time. So one of the book chapters in his 4-volume series on COVID and global inequalities. I have contributed a chapter on Detroit's COVID responses. And then I'm a consultant on the SSHRC grant he has in Kitchener-Waterloo, which he'll talk about today. But it's also really just nice to sort of have this international collaboration. I put in the chat, and I will put again throughout, I am actually got a SSHRC grant myself to do a cross-national conference on senior housing in May. So I invite anyone to register for it, and sort of that's where my work will be focused today. But I want to turn it over to Brian.
Thanks very much, Tam, and thanks very much, Walter, for the very kind words in the introduction. I really wish that I could be in Detroit today. I love visiting the city. I've been coming to Detroit for about 10 years now on a regular basis, and even managed to catch a few innings of the Tigers game yesterday on TV while we had it on in the background. They weren't doing very well, but there's not much new there. But my last visit to Detroit did manage to catch a game at Comerica Park, and also explored a little bit of the city. And I think some of the photos that I'll show are from that visit in probably 2018, even maybe 2019. It's, time kind of has a new meaning these days with everything that's happened. But hope I can come back soon and really see more about what's happening and meet many of you in person. So as Walter said, and Tam alluded to as well, I do a lot of visual work and a lot of photography. Started out as a hobby, but then really started thinking a bit more critically about how photography can be used as part of a critical analysis of the city. And so in this sort of about 10 minutes, I just want to give you a little bit of insights and perspectives about that. And then I'll come back, I guess, at the end and talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing here in Kitchener-Waterloo. So as Walter said, I had a photo exhibition. I'll share my screen here if I can do this. Shift the screen. Share. Slideshow. There we are. So you should be able to see a couple of photos that I took back in 2017 when I was still living in the Netherlands. And thinking about photography and thinking about, broader questions of my work, which is really based around sort of two broad things. So the first being sort of rendering visible things that are often invisible. In particular, rendering visible things that don't always show up in statistics. And I'll get to more detail about that in a moment. But a lot of my thinking around how photography plays a role in critical urban studies and a critical examination of the city is inspired by Peter Marcuse and some of his work around critical urban planning. And Marcuse talks about three different elements of critical urban planning: exposing, proposing, and politicizing. So exposing injustices, inequities, deficiencies, proposing alternatives, right? And politicizing, let's say, the geographies of the everyday city. That's how I've sort of interpreted that three-pronged approach of expose, propose, and politicize by Peter Marcuse. And so when I put together this first photo exhibition a couple years ago, I was trying to take what was ordinary in one place, and by showing it in a place where these were extraordinary, kind of expose some of the shortcomings of cycling planning, in this case in Toronto, but you could extend this broader to North America. Propose alternatives, right? These are proposing different ways of doing things, and politicizing the everyday aspects of mobility. Now, cycling, I assume in Detroit as well, but certainly in this part of the world is one of the most politicized aspects of city life. But it doesn't mean that we can't continue to put pressure on leaders and planners to come up with better ideas and better ways of implementing things like cycling. So that was, in addition to just, you know, a nice activity. I spent the last 3 or 4 months living in the Netherlands before moving back to Canada, sort of just photographing these, what are very unremarkable images, with the idea that they would be quite extraordinary moving back to Canada. And I didn't quite know what I would do with them, but then thinking a bit more and putting together this exhibition with that explicit aim of using these images to help enhance and shape conversations, and conversations that were already going on, right? I know I didn't come into a vacuum where nobody was thinking about better ways to do cycling. No one was, you know, looking to people were already looking to countries like the Netherlands, but trying to do that in a way that sort of pushed the debate a little bit further. So, as I said, I've been spending a lot of time in Detroit, and I've been spending enough time in Detroit that I can now start to go back to some of the photos that I took many years ago, going back to sort of 2012, 2013. These photos on the left are from that time period. And again, this will be quite familiar to many of you. And so as I've had a few chances to go back before the pandemic hit, I have been trying to rephotograph the images that I took now almost a decade ago. And so when I first started coming to Detroit, one of the things that I tried to do was just get to know the city, right? And before you enter into a community, because I'm a complete outsider to Detroit. I have no family. You know, I've been a Tigers fan for much of my life. I'm not entirely sure why. I think I saw a game at Tiger Stadium back in the early 90s and was so captivated. It was so different from Skydome, Rogers Center, and I sort of became hooked on the Tigers. But I have no connection to the place. But I've been studying it now for almost a decade. And one of the first things I did was try and really get to know the place, explore around on foot, by car, all these sorts of things, and sort of, you know, with photography, sort of photographing some of these ordinary spaces. And am now trying, obviously the pandemic has put this on hold, to re-photograph, because one of the techniques that I use in terms of, you know, using photography as a way to order and analyze and understand urban change is this process of repeat photography, which is essentially just re-photographing images at the same location, or roughly the same location, at different moments in time. And it has its origins in the natural sciences, looking at glaciers and tree vegetation. And it's only really in the last few decades that it's become a small-ish niche in thinking about you know, social change and social analysis. And there's a few things that I really like about repeat photography. The first is that it renders visible a lot of different elements of change and the urban landscape. It also allows you to see fine-grained detail, you know, building by building, street by street. So the Metropolitan building, the Wurlitzer building, right? One of many buildings that were abandoned for several decades. And now in the, I believe, again, 2018, 2019, the images on the right, you see them in their renovated state. And if you go back in different moments in time, you can see different phases of renovation as well. Another thing that photography in general, and I think repeat photography more specifically, is really powerful at doing, is beginning conversations or enhancing conversations. Elvin Wiley, the geographer from the University of British Columbia, talks about photography's role in beginning rather than ending conversations. Again, if photography is done well and ethically and with an understanding of its limitations, then these photos, I hope, will start conversations about what's happening here, what kind of investment is happening, who's benefiting from it, right? Who's excluded from it. And especially when you compare that with, there we go, with other parts of the city where there's still change happening. This is on the northeast side of Detroit, but the change is very different. So again, seeing these visuals, yes, some of this will show up in statistics, particularly, you know, I've started taking photos in Detroit in 2012. That kind of corresponds with the 2010 census, and now we're coming up to the 2020 census. But what new insights do we get from, you know, this fine-grained detail of physical change? And that relates to the fourth thing in which I think repeat photography is really good at, and again, photography more broadly, is that it helps to unify what are often very siloed and separate conversations. And I'm speaking about conversations about housing, land use, transportation, economic development, inequality, racism, sustainability, density, a whole host of other, a whole host of these conversations that all too often, particularly in the public sphere and even in the professional planning sphere, are treated as separate and siloed conversations. So the housing people talk about housing, the economic development people talk about economic development. When you see visual imagery of the city, when you see, particularly repeat photography, it helps to bind all these different elements together. So again, Walter talked about this book that is going to be out next year in February. I'm actually co-writing with my father, who's a retired professor from Ryerson University. So in this book, we look at old photos taken by streetcar enthusiasts in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s, and we rephotograph them to, again, understand the broad arcs of transition that Toronto has gone through over the past 50 years. So going from a predominantly industrial city, not really an important, the second city of Canada, Montreal at that point was the main city of Canada, to the country's premier center of, one of the major global financial hubs of the world, right? So what does that look like? And how do these photos help to unify some of these conversations? So again, we see this industrial landscape on the west side of the city. This was a Massey Ferguson plant that built tractors. Once free trade came along and Canadian farmers could buy cheaper tractors from the United States and Mexico, factories like these closed. And because Toronto is this major global center of finance, it eclipsed Montreal as Canada's premier city. We see not empty spaces and derelict spaces, but spaces that have been remarkably transformed into new condominium developments. And even this density pales in comparison to what has happened in more recent years. So again, photos like this link deindustrialization, economic shifts, wider shifts in a national urban hierarchy, gentrification, because this, for me and many others, is part of the gentrification landscapes of the contemporary city. And so, again, a view like this, and then it starts to ask questions of, well, who was working here, who's living here now, who's excluded, right? These neighborhoods in downtown Toronto, in a city that is one of the most multicultural and diverse in the entire world, these spaces are increasingly white and non-immigrant, right? So it raises a whole bunch of conversations also about what's happening in other parts of the city. And one of the things when we've gone through and looked at all these changes, and if you drive into Toronto, if you ever drive in on the Gardiner Expressway, you see these massive tall condominium towers, dozens of them that have gone up on old industrial land. What you don't see is the incredible amount of stability in the built form and the urban landscapes. So this image, the one on the left, was taken in 1966, about a month before a subway opened, and the subway station is right behind where this photographer, a man named John Bromley, was taking this picture in 1966. It's about 100 yards from where he's standing behind this image. Subway opens a month later, streetcar lines are abandoned for the subway. What's incredible is that this street, Lansdowne, we're a minute walk from a subway station. The subway has been there now for 50 years. The built environment is basically the same. There's some modifications, but there's been no change in density. And so what these photos, looking at the big picture, really reveal is a tale of two cities. One city where almost everything has changed physically, and the other city that is static and frozen in time. It's glacial. Change is glacial, almost referring back to, the original sort of origins of repeat photography, which was monitoring glaciers, right? We see very slow change. So we can see these very different trajectories in different parts of the city that photography helps to render visible. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. And Tam's going to pick up on some of these broader themes, not necessarily about photography, but some of these broader themes about stories of change, about rendering things visible. And then I'll come back and I'll talk a little bit about some of the methods I've been using here in Kitchener-Waterloo to talk about some of the other research here going on.
Thanks, Brian. Super. I'm going to now screen share. I would also say it's nice to see Kahari Brown here because he, like Brian, has written books with his dad. He's from our sociology department. Second of all, I'm going to just try to Also, I see several colleagues of mine from the School of Social Work, so I appreciate that. And again, for those of you who don't know me, I'm in social work, and I've been doing a lot of work sort of focusing on older adults in these changing landscapes, which I think you'll see the theme of soon. Hold on. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I just wanted to see if I could play a video, but I actually don't know. Maybe I can't play a video. Hold on. Hold on. Maybe if I don't screen share, I can play the video. And perhaps not. Okay, well, if we were to see the video, we would see that a couple years ago, Mayor Duggan, in his State of the City address, mentioned senior housing and people being facing displacement. And I guess the gist of it, and for many of you, you've seen other talks I've given around campus, is that sort of as HUD housing, as Section 8 housing contracts expired in the city, and they still continue to expire, there's the potential for displacement of lots of people, including older adults. So what I really like, and why I started wanted to show you that, is that we are very excited that this issue was taken up by the mayor, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the advocacy work we've been continuing to do. But I guess the other thing is sort of thinking about, as cities change, what is the role of older generations in urban communities is also something I would suggest people think about. So there's a coalition I'm very involved in called Senior Housing Preservation Detroit. And we meet once a month, and we've met once a month since 2013. And we're really proud that there are agencies serving seniors. There's United Community Housing Coalition, which is the largest sort of housing agency in the city. And the chair of this coalition is a tenant organizer named Claudia Sanford. But we have the aging groups like Detroit Area Agency on Aging. We have people sort of, I would say, operating senior housing like Presbyterian Villages of Michigan, CSI co-ops, CSI Support and Development, which are co-op housing. And so we've been able to sort of bring people around the table around looking at displacement of older adults. And what's interesting about my story I'm going to tell today is how this coalition that we've already had this structure of meeting monthly really operated in the last year in COVID. So again, here are some guiding questions that I think are important in my work, which are: how do we support older adults in residential transition if they want to move, need to move, or are forced to move to promote healthy aging? And how do we plan and build housing choices for those across socioeconomic spectrums and life histories, particularly in changing contexts, the theme of our talk today? And then how do we improve quality in congregate senior housing? And I would say this quality issue is something in a couple slides I'll talk about, because sometimes we cannot control the amount of affordable housing. I think we've all on this call sort of understood urban spaces are very much challenged by providing for its communities. And I remember when I spent time in Toronto in fall 2019, I attending 2 days of the Toronto City Council debating sort of their next 10-year housing plan, the 2020 to 2030 housing plan. And they were really aspiring for building 40,000 units. And then someone said, yes, but we need 100,000. Isn't 40,000 too little? Then someone else said, yes, but 40,000 units to do in 10 years is so ambitious. That's if provincial and federal funding all comes together. And so I think we know that urban spaces are dealing with affordable housing. And I guess, and you'll see that part of it is also realizing our advocacy and our research also needs to focus on quality. And what does that mean? So I've been doing a couple projects which I will share today. Oh, and then this coalition, we've definitely given input over the years to the city of Detroit and working with HRD, housing and revitalization in different ways. Here's HRD's plan where they thank SHPD, just FYI on that. But I actually also think, but I can't see everyone on the line, I think one of my co-authors on this first part of my presentation is on the line, Pat Rencher. I see that she is on the line. Pat is the editor of Urban Aging News, which is a print newspaper in the city for older adults. And I am partnering with two urban planners, Lisa Berglund from Dalhousie and Julie Ma from University of Toronto. And Pat and me, we are presenting this same talk at the American Association of Geographers on Thursday, April 8th. But also, we got together because we wanted to also look at media. So a little different than Brian, but when we were preparing our talk, we realized, oh, I could also do a media presentation. Not usually a part of my presentations, but this one is actually quite interesting. So Lisa and Julie were very interested in social media representations of change and development. And then I said, okay, but where's the older adult voice? And how could we get some sort of textual remnants to also do an analysis? So I read every issue of Pat's Urban Aging News from 2015 to now. And I would have to say I did not include excerpts of that because it was actually so much to present, and we're still doing the analysis. But you wait, next Humanities Center talk and other talks around town, we're gonna try to juxtapose sort of the social media scraping we did with the stories that older adults are writing about and thinking about. But for the purposes of this, I thought I'll just show you the media depictions around town, kind of in line with Brian's thinking. But I thank Pat for joining us on this project. So we just are sort of looking at, as people start, academics are taking photos, of course, developers are taking photos, people are depicting a new Detroit. And then we were like, well, do any of the pictures ever have older adults? Older Detroiters that may have lived here for 60, 70, 80 years. And so that's our investigation. And then again, phase two, sometime soon, we're gonna juxtapose it with what's in the Urban Aging News. And actually, Pat has pointed us to a couple other print media sources that we will use for sort of a discourse and photographic analysis. So again, for those of you familiar, this is sort of Campus Martius as a beach. And no people, people in the background there. But I'll just do a next slide. Oh, Andrea Sankar, there she is. I was just in a meeting with her half an hour ago. And then sort of our background is sort of looking at, as people market places, there's this certain target groups, the more affluent, often younger, often newcomers. And then also we were looking at, people also want a nostalgic cultural past. And then I guess sort of, we also in our research team acknowledge that in the gentrification literature, there's such a focus on race and class dimensions, but very little on how age factors into gentrification. And then we feel like we can contribute to how place branding actually acts as a tool for gentrification. And so we've identified that these age-related impacts are real, and how seniors are excluded in sort of these branding and marketing strategies also contributes to gentrification. So we have an example on the right of the slide, which is sort of, just an explicit statement. I think the broader question for Michigan is, when you're competing for talent, not just domestically, but globally, the younger generation in the world is looking for quality places. A lot of those quality places would be traditional cities with their downtowns and their waterfronts and their cultural institutions, and that sort of magic mix of street life. If you don't have cities that have that, it's hard to imagine how you can compete for the talent of the world. And then we've even been thinking of, okay, and we didn't really write down all the numbers, but we have a detailed methodology of how we got this social media scraping and the number of websites that were taken down, that the images were taken from. But the other thing is, we are in doing our analysis in the last few weeks, we also point out that it's not that this is not family friendly. It's actually that it's family friendly in a particular rendition of what a family is. So many things are actually marketed as family friendly. And sometimes multiple generations are pictured, even racially diverse. But a lot of emphasis is actually more on child friendly, family friendly, and even pet friendly. According to our social media scrape, there's really not mention of seniors in branding materials, and really no mention or rarely images of people with disabilities or physical limitations. And I just would say for this part of it, this sort of invisibility in the marketing that occurs is that, you know, it really links in the implications part, the idea of age and talent implicitly tied to sort of who we value and sort of what kind of vibrancy people can bring to a downtown corridor. And then also there's explicit funding, right? So there are public-private partnerships that provide financial incentives to attract young, educated, and talented individuals, while, as we know, and why the coalition I'm a part of has been existing and meeting monthly for the last 7 years, affordable senior housing in the city is very precarious. There's also sort of course, placemaking strategies that sort of highlight the amenities and entertainment that will, of course, cater to downtown professionals. And that we would argue that these multi-generational households, if mentioned in small ways, are really not the central image. The central image is this nuclear family with the young baby and the hip stroller, really. And then I didn't show an example of this, but I would say in our larger presentation on Thursday for the American Association of Geographies, we also have examples where sometimes actually even the buildings are portrayed, you know, come live here, and sort of showing this historic reuse of buildings, but actually the mention of the people who lived there in the buildings before is erased in those depictions. All right, so that's part one. And of course, Pat is on the line too, so we can she can give her feedback too in the Q&A. I welcome that. And then I'm just gonna go to a little bit more about the work I've been centrally doing with this coalition, really looking at sort of how older adults themselves feel about the changing city. And I would say, having spent time in other changing cities, you know, it's really interesting to see the experiences and perspectives of the longest living residences in cities. And so we made a documentary, which I don't believe I can play either, but I would say if you Google Holding Down the Fort, Seniors' Perspectives on Belonging in, let's see, A Changing Detroit, you can find the video. It's 10 minutes. It's a really nice documentary kind of depicting this, good for teaching purposes and also getting people interested in thinking about these topics. So I also conducted interviews on interviews with those being displaced, and I didn't list sort of all the methodology, but it was sort of older adults from one building who were displaced when their building went market rate. And of the 120 residents, we did 44 interviews. We were very, very excited to get that many participants. And also for those urban planners in the audience, it's really hard to find people who are displaced. So just in these different ways, we were able to figure out where they moved and then see if they wanted to sit for an interview. I really could have only done that work because of all my community partnerships. So I point you to one of the quotes from this woman, Debbie, that says, I felt that if they was going to upgrade the building, which we were complaining about long before they came in, about making certain changes to the building, I felt that they didn't have no regards to the seniors. They want to construct this for younger people, vitalize the downtown, and we was not to be a part of it. So a couple key points here. As buildings get renovated, in this situation, it's really making way for another person, except in cases where people are trying to sort of temporarily relocate older adults, renovate an apartment, and then bring the original resident back, which definitely happens. This is sort of making way for a younger person. And I think I point you to that again. I ask, and I think Brian nicely discussed sort of the role of different ways of looking at change. And so sometimes the interview data tells you a lot about people's feelings about, is this change for me? So, and then also there's the power of the images. And I would say this coalition that I've been working with for a long time, Senior Housing Preservation Report, we've tried to raise this issue of the place and belonging of older adults in the city. And we're featured in the Wall Street Journal, but we also, members of our coalition have been active, including me, testifying at City Council, promoting sort of ways to ensure new developments have affordable housing units, or also during the same date, which was September 2017, they passed an ordinance that required notification of local agencies if people were going to be displaced, as a way to sort of make sure that people didn't fall through the cracks. So that was something. And then Senior Appreciation Day, which again was, sort of before the pandemic swept us all away. This was an event that was held in a park, Capitol Park, actually, that was really a site of gentrifying spaces in Detroit, downtown, Washington Boulevard, as a way to sort of symbolically sort of take back, and by reserving the space and doing this big event, the role of older Detroiters. But I also want to say, and the connection I have to sort of the now, is that I would argue that this coalition that founded sort of to look at housing preservation and different ways to community agencies can work together, really were able to do a lot to meet some of the needs of older adults in the city in the pandemic because of our strong networks before. So our strategic plan is basically 7 words, maybe, which is, we said our goal was to understand the changing context, to always advocate, and to always continue to make connections. And so, and also we were able to publish this in an urban planning journal called Housing Policy Debate, how we developed the strategic plan and what it meant for housing coalition. So you can look that up. So it's just out. But I would argue that this same simple strategic plan is exactly how we tried to look at the needs of older adults living in senior housing in the pandemic. So understanding the changing context, we would say, or we did, we really upped our meetings. So we usually met weekly. We usually met monthly, but then March, April, May onwards, we started meeting weekly. So people would share, how are you keeping older adults safe? And I guess I'm assuming everyone on this call has understood the disproportionate impact of older adults in COVID, and also sort of the disproportionate racial impact. And so older Detroiters were very much hit hard. 80% of deaths in the city are from people 60 and older, and 88% of the deaths in the city are African Americans. And that's all from the Detroit Data Health Dashboard. So what was interesting is when we started meeting together so often, we were really sharing information. What is your policy? So people were sharing policies of what they were doing in senior buildings. But we were also sort of talking about the safety concerns of residents and staff, because keeping staff coming in a pandemic was really hard. So we were sharing sort of how were people doing it, how were they rotating staff. Like staff, then a lot of them had young kids at home because their schools closed. So we talked about all sorts of issues like that. We also successfully advocated that older adults in low-income senior housing in the city should not be on public transportation trying to find testing, trying to find toilet paper, trying to find groceries, etc. And so that really got all the way to the ear, I think, of the mayor, and we advocated that testing be brought to buildings. So then we would share information like, when is testing coming to your building? When is it happening? How is the rotation going? And then later now, vaccines are brought to senior buildings in the city. And then in partnership with the AARP of Michigan, we got a grant to both do a small survey, I guess, of sort of what kind of food insecurity people were facing in certain senior buildings, and then also figuring out a distribution in partnership with gleaners, et cetera. I would say, very key details are like, you have seniors, you have some people who do not cook and really would benefit from a different kind of grocery box than people who are, I actually actively cook, and that I would want a different kind of box of food. So I just wanted to let y'all know how active this housing coalition has been in the city in the pandemic. But then going back to this other issue of sort of safety and renovation. So this goes back to what I said about quality, which is, again, creating more housing units is really hard. It's actually mostly a federal level issues. But then how can we make sure that people living in senior housing receive a high quality of life and high standards? So we did this, both a special issue, but also we did a community event with the city's Housing and Revitalization Department, where we presented 3 case studies of different senior buildings that had to do renovations. Either renovations were already started before the pandemic hit, or like actually they planned and then they're renovating senior buildings in order to create better spaces, more updated units. But how do you do that safely in a pandemic? And so I think of that, and this is almost my last slide because I'm actually not even sure what time it is. But I would say this, these issues on safety and renovation were both timely, because how do you do this in a pandemic, but also timeless. How do you think of older adults who are going to be out of their apartments for a month at a time? Or can they really sit in a community room for 8 hours at a time? If people are used to having naps, different medication regimens, different things, sort of how does construction affect their lifestyle is also a timeless issue. I think that might be my last slide. And again, just hoping that this brown bag, I will turn it back over to Brian, kind of stirs our interest in understanding change and the people affected by it. Brian, you have a few last words maybe before we open it up?
Sure. How much time do I have before?
I like to say like 7 minutes. I think I went long, and sorry about that.
That's okay.
I couldn't see a clock.
No worries. I will quickly share my screen again because I want to talk a little bit. I've got a couple of images here, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing here, which I think really connects with some of the work that you've been doing, Tam, particularly around things like displacement. You talk about the renovations in housing and renovictions, which is a term that's really gone over the past 5 years from being a fairly obscure academic or housing activist term to one that's in the newspaper now, needs no definition or no further explanation. So I've been working a lot with in a way that's maybe less structured to your coalition, Tam, but working a lot here with local community organizations and nonprofits and even some local governments as well that have been involved. And again, this was a a project that took several years to really lay the groundwork and the foundations and build up trust, particularly with nonprofits. But it has led to this partnership development grant, the SHIRT grant that Tam is also a part of. And the starting point for this project here was really a report that our regional government looked at or produced a number of years ago. And it said, it acknowledged that yes, gentrification was happening in our downtown cores. Detroit has a small little streetcar line, which is also part of fueling gentrification in many ways. We have a 19-kilometer, about 11-mile light rail line that opened in 2019. Kitchener-Waterloo region is the smallest place in North America to have a full-fledged LRT system. And it has brought about $3 or $4 billion worth of investment along the corridor. So I can look out, I take my 3-year-old for a walk down the road here, and we can easily spot 7 or 8 construction cranes of new buildings going up. And so the region and local governments and various organizations have been monitoring what's been happening. And one of the conclusions was, yes, gentrification is happening. Statistically, average incomes are rising, but those same statistics didn't show indications that displacement was taking place. So as I start talking with nonprofits, and I've been doing a lot of work with an organization called the Social Development Center of Waterloo Region, and you start talking with people from there, you start talking with other nonprofits, and you tell them this, if they don't already know from the region's report, and they're shocked. They basically laugh. They say, no, people are being displaced all the time. We're losing all this housing. And again, coming back to what we talked about at the outset, rendering visible things that don't always show up in things like statistical analysis. And so the impetus of this project has been to try and render visible different forms of gentrification, displacement, and eviction that aren't always visible or aren't yet visible in statistics. And so again, photography is part of this. So I include this, this small building on the left here. This is in downtown Kitchener, a convenience store, and then 2 floors of apartments above. And you'd walk past this and not really think about it, right? You wouldn't really think anything about it. It's just a fairly nondescript building. But it was demolished to make way for this new condo building. That this photo on the right is now a year or so old, and the building's about 4 or 5 stories above ground now. And again, this is loss of already existing affordable housing. This was not government housing, not subsidized housing, private market, but the lowest end of the private market housing that gets, in the case of this total convenience, gets demolished. The building on the left that says the Chambers, this is an example of renoviction. This was a building that had 3 or 4 stories of apartments that were low-end apartments, not quite rooming houses there elsewhere, but cheap apartments that people who are living on disability or living on social assistance could afford, probably not comfortably, but they could at least afford to have rent, to pay rent there. About 4 or 5 years ago, that building was renovated, everyone was kicked out, and they were scattered elsewhere. And again, that question that you raised, Tam, of people who are displaced are really hard to find. One of the things with doing this work with the Social Development Center is they have a very well-established network of what they call community connectors, who are people from affected communities who work with the Social Development Center to help. Social Development Center will do, for example, they'll help municipalities reach hard-to-reach populations for surveys and community engagement and things like that. They also do a lot of advocacy work. So they have this network that allows us to learn more about what's happening with marginalized communities. And so partnering with them, we've been able to render visible some of these stories of displacement. We've also been able to highlight and amplify some of the knowledge that people have of their own communities. So one of the things, you speak to anybody who lives in a place and they can tell you something about their community. And a lot of the planning knowledge that planners use is statistics or key informant interviews. And the inherent knowledge that particularly marginalized communities have about their street, their neighborhood, the buildings, their own building, that is rarely assembled and used in planning and policymaking. And so what we've done in one of the first phases of this project is we've put together an interactive map that assembles these stories. So we had, I think in total about 50 interviews over 2 years in 2019 and 2020. I did some in 2019, and then we had some students and some people from the Social Development Center continuing the work in 2020. And we've mapped instances of displacement, various forms, because displacement is not just a spatial thing. There's many non-spatial aspects of displacement that are going on. But again, you see some of these clusters. If you can see where my arrow is here, this was a series of small buildings that were demolished to make way for a condo. These were some old houses that were largely rented out, that are all demolished. There's a new project going in here. Incidentally, my house is around here, so very centrally located. So I see a lot of this in my own walkings around. A renoviction project here, some other new developments here. So this is by no means a complete story, because we've only interviewed a small number of people. But what it does is it helps to move beyond just an anecdote or two and actually start assembling this knowledge. And so what we're saying is, here's knowledge, and we're basically the conduits. We're helping to bring it together, and we're helping to amplify it. The next steps are to actually use that knowledge in planning and policy making. And that's really important. I just want to spend this maybe 1 or 2 minutes to talk about the pandemic, because that's really important, I think, in the pandemic times, because one of the things that I've been thinking about in this book project and in some of the other work that we've been doing around the pandemic and the impact particularly on marginalized communities here is really thinking about what has changed, right? People are still getting evicted. Renovictions are still happening. Displacement is still happening. And, what, even some of the things that have changed. So we have, hotels that are now being used for homeless populations, to house homeless populations, but these are designed to be temporary. These aren't designed to be the city or the region or the nonprofit is taking over this hotel. This is a temporary measure that, unless something changes, this will revert back to a hotel when it's profitable to rent things out as a hotel again. And so, maybe the question is also, what's remained the same, or what has been amplified, right? There's a lot of what we're seeing is an amplification of things that were already there. And, you see a lot of writing about, what's the future of the city going to look like? Or I saw something, like, I saw a headline once, will the pandemic lead to more affordable housing? And okay, that article might have had a bit more nuance, but that very title is sort of speculative. And I want to reframe it as, what are the conditions that actually need to change to bring about more equitable cities? And, planning is really about power and power relations. And some people in the planning system, some groups, some residents, some organizations have a lot of power, and some groups have very little. And I've seen very little over the past year that has fundamentally shifted those power relations. So what we're trying to do with some of this lived experience work is to, amplify these voices, to put them centrally in planning and policy conversations. We've had some success. So the City of Kitchener's new affordable housing strategy has a really important element of bringing in lived experience voices, right? But I'm under no delusions that this is only a first step. The first step is to bring these voices into the conversation. The second step is to actually have those voices be key to making those decisions. And we're not there yet. But again, if we're thinking about what hasn't changed in the pandemic, very little of that has. What do we need to create more equitable cities in the future? We need some fundamental things to change in the way we plan and govern our cities, that so far have been relatively unaffected by the pandemic. So I think I'll leave it there, and I hope we have time for some questions. But thanks very much, everyone, for attending today, and thanks, Tam, for organizing this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So
okay, we do our claps, I guess.
Yes. So this concludes the presentation portion of this brown bag. Now we move it to Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand either physically or using the raise your hand icon, or post any questions in the chat. So anyone has anything, they are free to ask away.
John Gruder.
Yes, I was very delighted by this because I don't see seniors. I live in a senior apartment building myself in Detroit. So, and I live, it's in part in public housing. And I've seen like the area you were mentioning, Brian, about that area down by Capitol Park, where they just moved all the seniors out, and a lot of the low income, they just basically pushed them out. And now they got all this gentrification, but the seniors are never part of the, it seems like they're part of the input at all. And it was really glad to hear you put that. I was really pleased to hear your talk.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the kind words, and you know, I've been, you've seen this far more than I have, but I remember going to Detroit in about 10 years ago, and you know, someone was pointing out to me all these buildings that were just abandoned and others that were still inhabited, but you know, maybe hadn't been renovated for a while. And now, I mean, you're hard pressed to find abandoned buildings in the downtown core, right? You go out to the further out in some of the neighborhoods, it's different, but yeah, no, thanks. And thanks for sharing that.
Thank you, Pam, Tam, too. Thank you.
Oh, for sure. And I think there's, you know, I just wanted to say, like, what I was describing, sort of the agency level work, the professional work, I think we need to develop better ways to bring the older adults to the table themselves in Detroit, even though I think there are mechanisms, but sort of what I guess we want to be glass half full, the fact that all these agencies don't stop in our advocacy to highlight the needs of seniors, especially in the pandemic with the kind of unique set of challenges. You know, and I would also say State Senator Stephanie Chang sends staff every month to our coalition. So I think there's a way that we have lots of contact with the sort of policymakers and sort of agency heads. So I think that's been a good thing. Anyone else? I hope this has been interesting. I encourage anyone who wants to, so when I clarify about my conference, the Canadian government is sponsoring a conference, and it's actually going to pair experts from Canada and the US across the country, in both countries, on the issue of senior housing, particularly as a way to say, like, though our issues, though our systems are very different, there are a lot of shared issues. And so, older adults are free to attend the conference. Students are $15 Canadian, and non-students are $25 Canadian. And let me know if you need a free coupon. I can get you in.
Tam, there's a comment by Alison Lasky. So if you can look at that comment and see if you have any comment to make on her comment.
Yeah, I see that you can set a clock to these people. I would also say, when our coalition started meeting years ago, you know, it was very interesting that Detroit was also being marketed as like a blank slate, as if people didn't live here. That sort of, and so this idea that people have lived their lives in these same spaces, and even Brian's picture of like the apartment unit above that was like, oh, where did they go? Right, the idea that people were living their lives, but then a perception of, oh, we don't need to see that as we think of development. And I think there's also another thing about sort of not being anti-development, because that's really impossible to do, but really pushing for thoughtful, ethical, inclusionary development as a framework for going forward. So I hope that's helpful.
One of the, just to sort of jump in on that, one of the things that we've been talking about here is using publicly owned land to achieve some of the aims in terms of genuinely affordable non-market housing. So, you know, on privately owned land, we have some inclusionary zoning rules that or powers that cities can adopt, but they're quite new, and they're also quite basic. And where we are here, because of the changes, the economic changes in this community, there are a lot of pieces of very prime real estate that are publicly owned and today are surface parking lots. And so myself and others have really been pushing and saying, you know, this is where the genuinely transformative solutions are going to come. This is where the housing that's outside of the realm of market speculation, the genuinely affordable housing, is going to come. And really trying to push local governments not to sell that land, but to use it and work with other, work with nonprofits, work with, a variety, good developers who are interested in building affordable housing. And there are many, there are some in our community, to build the kind of housing that the market is unable and unwilling to do. And that can be, that doesn't have to be just, subsidized housing. We are now seeing larger units, where there's a shortage of larger units in our urban core, because the most profitable thing to build for developers is very small condo units of 400 or 500 square feet, 1-bedroom units. They're popular with investors. And so all other housing basically loses out, right? It's not that it's not profitable. It's just it's more profitable to build a tower with lots of tiny boxes in it. And there are ways you can play around with that, right? And there, New Zealand is, for example, has different mortgage rate requirements for owner occupiers and investors. There's all sorts of things around that, but really the transformative stuff comes on the publicly owned land, I think. And I can walk a minute from my house and see a big parking lot that's hardly ever used, and it's owned by our city. And I'd love to see that turned into some sort of affordable housing.
I have a comment. I know we're a little over, but I thought this talk was extremely interesting. Before I came to the community center, I used to work for a small nonprofit called the Woodbridge Neighborhood Development Corporation. We had to take off the corporation because it was scaring people. But the nonprofit is in the neighborhood not that far from Wayne State University, neighborhood that I grew up in. And after college, I came back to do my MBA. And some of the work that we did is this neighborhood is known to have professors, students, young professionals, but also low income and seniors. And sometimes they're forgotten in the process. So, our job was really, like you said, Timmy, not to fear development, but educate and try to include our senior and low income residents. And one thing that we tried to do is offer low income and senior minor home repair grants for our residents, because a lot of our residents, they fear that, they have these homes that they can't keep up with, they can't afford to put a guardrail or safety rails and things like that. So because a lot of seniors, they want to stay in their neighborhood, they want to stay where they grew up, they want their grandkids to come, but they can't afford it, or they feel like they don't have a place when it comes to development. So I don't know, I just thought that was really interesting. And the work that you're doing, Professor Perry, is extremely important for the seniors in Detroit. And we're definitely going to spread the conference for our social media, because I feel like it's important. And sometimes they are forgotten, and they do have such rich resources and knowledge for the different communities in Detroit that is not being tapped into. Just sitting down and having a discussion on a porch, you can learn a vast of just so much, and that is just being neglected at times. So the fact that there are individuals out there that are caring about our seniors is great. So I just wanted to make that comment before we go. I think Dr. Edwards has some words, but
And I also just have to thank Brian for partnering on this. We have other things we're partnering on, but it's a lot to, do an international brown bag on a Tuesday. So thank you.
yes.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I always enjoy these kind of things. And it's a nice balance today. Tuesdays, I take my kids to forest school, so we're outside for most of the day. So we're back in now, heading back outside later this afternoon, and it's always nice. You never know what kind of things grow out of these kind of conversations down the line, right? And I hope at some point we can do this in person, either in Kitchener or in Detroit. But it's been great. I've enjoyed it, and learning from you as well, Tam, and all the amazing work that you're doing. So thanks for having me.
I'm glad that you were able to give us permission to post this talk on our website, because this is absolutely important. This was one of the talks that I really wanted standing room only, and that would be 300 people. But because it's so important, people talk a lot about the revitalization, the rebirth of the city, the this and that, but this is the kind of work that we need to be done. So thank you so much, and if you give us permission, we'll make sure it gets on our website and publicized as much as possible. Okay, thank you. All right,
Yes.
well.
Yeah, and before we go, I just have a quick announcement that I do for all of our speakers. We thank you both so much, and we're so glad that the Humanities Center can give you a platform to share this research and wealth of knowledge. As a small token of our gratitude, we do have 2 gifts for both of you. It's a mask and a journal with the Humanities Center logo that we hope you wear and use with pride. We'll be connecting with you towards the end of the semester to safely get these gifts to both of you. I know you're in Canada, but we might just have to mail it over. But again, thank you so much. And again, if you check the chat, I did post the documentary, the link to the documentary in the chat. So I'll stay on a little after for anyone that wants to download the registration form or check out the link or any other resources. But thank you 2 so much. And it's been a pleasure to have you. And we definitely want you back, Professor Perry. And I know you had mentioned about maybe having another brown bag. So if you look in the chat, we do have the applications for next year. We would love to invite you and whoever guests that you have to come on down. We are open and here for it. So thank you all to our audience as well. This concludes our brown bag. If our speakers have any closing words, I'll just stay on for a couple minutes. But yeah.
Well, I will say the shout out to the Urban Aging News. Next time I present, I'm going to co-present with Pat. We're going to have something super on the local Detroit scene and sort of the media representations. Yeah, no, feel free to email me or Brian. And thank you so much for coming. Stay well, everyone, too.
Everyone have a good one.
Bye-bye. I've put my email and my Twitter in the chat. If anyone ever wants to continue the conversation, be happy to do so.
Yes. Dr. Edwards, you just want to stay on for a couple minutes just so we can chat, but everyone else, you're free to go and enjoy the rest of your day in the sun while it lasts. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.